The senator from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, families in Texas and across the country are being pummeled by the highest inflation in 40 years. For everything from gasoline to groceries to clothing to utility bills, basic expenses have skyrocketed. Groceries just don't cost more, they're also harder to find. Empty shelves have become a sign of the times as supply chain problems, staffing shortages, and severe weather have created a perfect storm. On top of that, families are trying to stay safe and healthy in the midst of a surge in COVID-19 cases. There's an urgent need for testing and masks, both of which are increasingly hard to come by. So with so many urgent needs facing families in Texas and elsewhere, what does the Democratic leadership have teed up for the Senate this week? A partisan bill to take over the nation's elections. Democrats apparently want people to forget about the fact that they can't keep their refrigerators or pantries stocked, or their kids are out of school and because of the pandemic and can't study in person, or that it costs a small fortune to fill up your gas tank. Apparently, they are trying to convince the American people that there is somehow a coordinated assault on the right to vote, and their partisan legislation is the only savior. According to our colleagues, the evidence of this attack can be found in a number of state laws passed this last year, even though many of the reforms in those laws make voting easier than in a number of blue states. The Georgia law, for example, extends the early voting period to 17 days, giving voters more time than what's offered in the president's home state of Delaware, that until this year did not allow any in-person early voting. When that argument fails, though, our colleagues say the need for this legislation stems from the attack on the Capitol of January the 6th, even though their bill was written long before a mob descended on this building. In fact, the first version of the For the People Act was introduced in 2019, more than 3 years ago. The so-called voting rights crisis is nothing more than manufactured hysteria to justify our colleagues' long-standing attempts to take over America's elections. And just to put a time frame around the concerns, this is what 94% of respondents to a Pew poll, a nonpartisan poll, said about the 2020 elections. 94% said it was easy or very easy to cast their ballot. And yet the legislation that is going to be considered today has its origins in a 2019 bill called the For the People Act, which obviously predates this poll from the Pew Corporation. Well, I have no doubt that the Senate will reject this legislation once again. But I never cease to be amazed at how far our colleagues are willing to go to enhance their own political power purely along partisan lines. Matter of fact, they've done a complete about-face. Less than 5 years ago, the majority leader said we should build a firewall around the legislative filibuster. He's now laid the groundwork and will call the vote to end it. The Democratic leader has tried to frame this radical move as a way to promote debate. But make no mistake, our colleagues aren't trying to blow up the Senate to force Republicans to explain our opposition to the election takeover bill. In fact, we've done that endlessly. We don't need this drama in order to explain our position. I, for one, have spent hours on the Senate floor explaining the dangers of this partisan legislation, as have many of my other colleagues. The only conclusion I can reach is our Democratic colleagues are trying to blow up the Senate in order to clear a path for purely partisan legislation, to take a body that was actually created to promote bipartisan consensus building and make it possible with purely Democrat votes to work their will in a body that represents some 330 million Americans. What a bad idea that would be, to promote purely partisan legislation and dissuade or take away the incentives that encourage us to do what doesn't come naturally, and that is to actually work together and build consensus. Our colleagues apparently don't realize how short-sighted this move actually is. In the Senate, the door actually swings both ways. One day, you're in a majority. The next day, you're using every tool at your disposal to have a say in the process while representing your constituents. And no matter how much frustration and heartache the filibuster creates for the majority parties, and the shoe is always capable of being on the other foot. Those of us who've been here a while have been in the majority and in the minority and understand the frustration that a majority feels when they can't get what they want while complying with the Senate rules and the consensus building requirement of the 60-vote cloture vote requirement. But if our colleagues succeed in blowing up the filibuster, there's no question that it'll be easier for them to turn their progressive wish list into the law of the land. And you can't just carve out one piece of legislation. Once we head down that slippery slope, the legislative filibuster is gone. Taking over America's elections may be the first item on their agenda, but it won't be the last. They could pass the Green New Deal 2.0, impose sweeping gun control laws, legalize abortion from the time of conception until the time of natural delivery, and force every individual in the country into a one-size-fits-all health care plan. They could expand the Supreme Court and pack it with partisan justices. They could even add new states, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., and add to their majority into the Senate while doing so. There would be no limit, no constraint, not even a speed bump on what our Democratic colleagues could do if they created so-called carve-outs for every bill they dub must-pass legislation. The entirety of the radical left's wish list could become law without having to gain a single Republican vote. Of course, there's one big caveat here. Our Democratic colleagues can only do that if they retain the majority. As our colleagues know, power is fleeting, and at some point the shoe will always be on the other foot. The sign on Senator Schumer's door may say Majority Leader today, but that won't last forever. In a year, Republicans could hold the majority in both the Senate and the House. 3 years from today, we could have a Republican president-elect. I'd like to ask my colleagues what happens then. When Republicans control the Senate, the House, and the White House, as Democrats do now, how would our colleagues feel about the new rule book that they've created? Will they stand by their decision to silence the minority and ignore the millions of the people those senators represent? Not a chance. Mr. President, the filibuster is eliminated. It doesn't just pave the way to our Democratic colleagues' agenda. It clears the path for the majority's agenda, whichever party that may be. Now, liberal activists may like the idea of nuking the filibuster today, but they'll soon find themselves ruining the day their party broke the Senate. The next Republican-controlled Senate could make the 2017 tax cuts permanent, ensure that blue state millionaires are required to pay their fair share of federal taxes. We could make sure that there would be investments in border security and immigration enforcement, and craft reforms to reduce the immigration court backlog. We could withhold federal funding from sanctuary cities and prioritize the deportation of violent criminals. We could implement a 20-week ban on abortions and ensure that any baby that survives an abortion receives life-saving care. We could expand school choice to give students and parents more options when it comes to a quality education. We could protect our constituents' Second Amendment rights and establish concealed carry reciprocity throughout the nation. We could pass right-to-work laws, expand natural gas production, and make even more investments in our national security. In short, a future Republican-controlled Senate would be able to accomplish a lot, all thanks to a precedent that our Democratic colleagues seek to establish today. And while I would love to see many of these bills that I just mentioned become law, I oppose any effort to eliminate or weaken the legislative filibuster, just as we did when we were in the majority, working with a Republican president during the preceding 4 years. There's no scenario in which partisan wins are more important than long-term stability for our laws and our public policy. It's not just the American people who would experience whiplash under this game of ping pong. Imagine the chaos our economy would endure if laws were simply changed every couple of years because a new majority comes into place. Without some degree of predictability, how could businesses, small and large alike, make investments that would pay off in the future and create more jobs and help grow our economy? This is why we need the filibuster for every piece of legislation that comes out of the Senate. The much derided 60-vote threshold is there to ensure the stability of our country's laws and policies that are not affected by the transitory majorities that we find here in Congress. I know the Democratic leader and many of our colleagues are moved to action by their political base. And some may actually be worried about having a primary opponent unless they go to the mat trying to eliminate the filibuster. Well, some of our colleagues have experienced unbelievable pressure, particularly the senator from West Virginia and the senator from Arizona. And last night, if the press reports are accurate, when asked whether the majority leader would support a contested primary run against Senators Manchin and Senator Sinema, he didn't respond. The senator from Vermont, Senator Sanders, did respond and said he would consider supporting a primary opponent to the senator from West Virginia and the senator from Arizona. I would make the point it was the junior senator from Vermont who made that statement, not the presiding officer. So in the Democratic Party, if you can't vote your conscience anymore, you either have to fall in line or your colleagues will make every effort to try to kick you out. Well, I have some news for our friends across the aisle. If they think liberal activists are upset now, they haven't seen anything yet. Because if the majority leader successfully blows up the rules of the Senate, the radical left will have a full-on meltdown when Republicans regain the majority, which could be as soon as next year. Regardless of which party holds the majority, the Senate rules should not be bent or broken to achieve strictly partisan wins. Democrats' attempt to blow up the Senate is reckless and embarrassingly short-sighted. You wonder if anybody learned anything out of the debates and the nuclear option that was used strictly for judicial nominations, which resulted in 3 Republican nominees being confirmed to the Supreme Court during the last president's term of office. Later today, all 100 senators will go on the record. Each member will vote on whether to silence 50 senators and the tens of millions of people that those of us in the majority represent. All of my Republican colleagues support the filibuster, even when we have received a lot of pressure, like the senator from Arizona and the senator from West Virginia have had from people in their own political party, including the President of the United States, because we have stood in favor of that requirement because of the stabilizing force that it provides. And again, forcing us to do something that doesn't necessarily come natural, and that is to work together and build bipartisan consensus. Don't get me wrong, it's hard in this polarized country to work together and find common ground, but it's essential that we continue to do so where we can. Our Democratic colleagues used to agree. In fact, it's been less than 5 years since 27 of our current Democratic colleagues signed a letter arguing that the filibuster should be preserved. We'll see if those colleagues and the many others who've defended the filibuster end up caving to the radical left in their political base and vote to blow up the Senate. For the sake of the American people, our economy, and the long-term stability of our government, I hope this ends up being another failed vote. Mr. President, I yield the floor.